In the heart of Philadelphia, construction workers unearthed a chilling discovery beneath an abandoned billboard. What seemed like an ordinary workday quickly became the scene of an unsettling revelation. The body of a young man, long presumed missing, had been buried there for over 7 years. The body was identified as Darius Hill, a college student whose disappearance had haunted his family, friends, and the community for years. His case, once thought to be just another unsolved mystery, was now at the center of a sinister and complex web of secrets. Darius Hill was last seen walking home from his university in 2014. His sudden disappearance left no trace, no clues, just a gap in the lives of those who loved him. For years, investigators followed dead ends, and the case faded into the shadows of forgotten cold cases. But this discovery, buried beneath an old billboard promoting a youth mentorship program, would ignite a series of events that would uncover not just the truth about Darius's fate, but the deeply disturbing secrets of the pastor behind the program. The billboard, once an emblem of hope, now stood as a grim reminder of the betrayal that had occurred under its very shadow. As the investigation unfolds, shocking truths begin to surface, revealing a chilling conspiracy that shattered the facade of one of Philadelphia's most respected public figures. Darius Hill was a young man with dreams far beyond the limits of his circumstances. A college student with a bright future, Darius was driven by his desire to make a difference. He enrolled at a local university in Philadelphia, where he was known for his passion for learning and his infectious energy. To his family, he was a source of pride, the kind of son any parent would hope for. Yet, despite his bright future, Darius was drawn into a mentorship program that seemed to promise the world, but would ultimately become a trap that would cost him everything. The program, advertised on billboards around the city, was run by a charismatic pastor known for his powerful sermons and political influence. On the surface, it appeared to be a noble cause aimed at helping young people rise above their circumstances. The pastor, a well-respected figure in the community, had created a network of supporters who saw him as both a spiritual leader and a mentor. To many, he represented a beacon of hope. But behind the polished image and community praise, a much darker reality lay hidden. As the investigation into Darius's disappearance began to unravel, the truth became clear. Darius's involvement in the mentorship program was not as innocent as it seemed. The connections between the pastor, his program, and Darius's final days began to emerge, revealing a pattern of manipulation and control that extended far beyond the reach of a simple mentorship. Darius's life, once filled with potential, had become entwined with a man whose power and influence were used to conceal horrific truths. This is the story of a young man's tragic fate and the power structures that shielded the truth for so long. To explore the chilling details of Darius Hill's story, and to uncover the dark secrets hidden behind the community's most respected figure, subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Stay with us as we continue to peel back the layers of this complex case, exposing the forces at play and the truth that's finally coming to light. Darius Hill was not just a college student. He was the heartbeat of his family, a young man with high aspirations and a strong sense of purpose. Raised by a tight-knit family who had always supported him, Darius's life seemed on a clear upward trajectory. His parents were proud of his academic success, and his friends admired his unwavering drive. To many, Darius represented the promise of a better future, fueled by education and ambition. Yet, despite the love and encouragement from his family, something inside Darius was drawing him toward the mentorship program. The program, run by Pastor Alan Rhodes, a powerful and charismatic figure in the local community, promised to shape the future of its participants. Rhodes was not just a pastor, but a political figure with deep ties to influential individuals. His mentorship program had an aura of respectability, its advertisements adorning billboards across Philadelphia. His reputation as a man who helped uplift young people was well established, and many viewed him as a beacon of hope in a struggling community. As a mentor, he presented himself as a father figure, offering guidance, resources, and connections to help young men like Darius build a successful future. It was no surprise, then, that Darius, with his desire for success and sense of purpose, was drawn to Rhodes's program. However, beneath the surface of the pastor's outwardly noble facade, things were not as they seemed. While Darius's family saw the program as an opportunity for growth, they didn't know the full extent of Rhodes's influence and control. For Darius, what began as an attempt to build a future became a downward spiral. The mentor-student relationship morphed into one of manipulation, where Darius was not only shaped by Rhodes's guidance, but subtly controlled by his manipulative tactics. Rhodes's growing power within the mentorship program mirrored his influence in the community, and Darius, with his trust in the pastor, became entangled in a web of secrecy. On the outside, Darius's family remained unaware of the dynamics unfolding behind closed doors. They saw Darius as the same young man they had raised, driven, focused, and determined to succeed. But friends and those closest to him began noticing subtle changes in his behavior. He became increasingly distant, often retreating into his own world. Friends reported that Darius would sometimes make cryptic remarks about the pressure he was feeling, especially from the mentorship program, but he rarely elaborated. The pastor, who seemed like a trusted figure, was gradually becoming a more dominant force in Darius's life. The dynamic shifted from mentor to something more coercive. As the investigation later revealed, Darius's once bright future was increasingly overshadowed by his growing dependence on the pastor's approval and influence. The friendship and familial bonds that had defined Darius's life began to fade, replaced by a relationship that was more about control than mentorship. In this section, we see how Darius's interactions with those closest to him, his family, friends, and Pastor Rhodes, created a perfect storm of trust, manipulation, and control. The relationships that seemed supportive and promising were, in fact, part of a broader narrative of secrecy and power that would eventually lead to Darius's tragic fate. Darius Hill's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a series of unsettling events that hinted at the danger he was unknowingly walking into. His once promising future took a dark turn as he became increasingly involved in the mentorship program. And the early warning signs were there, though they were subtle enough to be easily overlooked. In the months leading up to Darius's vanishing, his family and close friends began to notice his growing unease. He had always been an ambitious young man, but now he seemed withdrawn, even restless. His usual confidence was replaced with a quieter demeanor. He became less responsive to his family's inquiries, often brushing off their concerns with vague assurances. Darius had always been close to his mother, sharing his academic achievements and personal aspirations with her. But now, their conversations grew distant. She noticed he was becoming preoccupied with the mentorship program, more so than usual, and often mentioned how busy the pastor kept him. His family brushed it off as the natural result of a full schedule, unaware of the true toll the program was taking on him. One of the most telling signs came when Darius began distancing himself from his friends. A few of them reported that he started to cancel plans or arrive late, all under the guise of extra work for the program. There were also whispers among his peers about how much control Pastor Rhodes seemed to exert over the program's participants. But Darius never seemed to acknowledge these concerns. To outsiders, the program was a path to success, a legitimate opportunity. To Darius, it seemed more like a looming obligation, a pressure he couldn't escape. Though he rarely spoke about the details, there were moments when he confided in friends about how he felt suffocated by the expectations placed on him. His behavior became erratic, his once optimistic outlook now clouded with uncertainty. He seemed torn between his loyalty to the pastor and a growing sense of discomfort, which he couldn't fully explain. Friends described him as conflicted, caught between the allure of success promised by the program and a gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came the day Darius received an unexpected call from Pastor Rhodes. It was a brief conversation, but it marked a noticeable shift in Darius's demeanor. When he hung up, he seemed shaken, his face pale. He told his friends that he needed to focus more on the program, but he didn't elaborate. In hindsight, this was seen as a critical moment, the day Darius began to close himself off from the outside world completely. For those who knew him best, it was the moment they began to fear something was terribly wrong. Shortly after that conversation, Darius stopped communicating with his family altogether. His phone calls became less frequent, and texts went unanswered for days. His disappearance became even more baffling, as no one had received any alarming messages or heard anything that could explain his sudden silence. His last known communication was a brief, cryptic text to his mother, saying, "I'll be back soon, just need to take care of something important." Those words would haunt her forever. The pattern of erratic behavior, the mounting pressure from the program, and the disconnection from his support network all pointed to the growing influence of Pastor Rhodes. It was becoming increasingly clear that what had once seemed like a mentorship opportunity was turning into something far darker, with Rhodes pulling strings in ways that no one had fully understood at the time. Darius had become a pawn in a dangerous game of manipulation, and those closest to him were only beginning to realize the peril he was in. In retrospect, the warning signs were all there, the changes in Darius's behavior, his isolation, and the overwhelming pressure from a man he had once trusted. But at the time, no one could have predicted just how far this story would go, nor how deeply it would unravel the life of a young man who had once been full of promise. Darius's disappearance was no longer just the result of a missing person case. It was the beginning of an investigation that would expose the true nature of Pastor Rhodes and the network of control and manipulation that surrounded him. As the investigation into Darius Hill's disappearance began to gather momentum, the case took a more sinister turn. What had initially seemed like an isolated event, a missing college student, quickly evolved into a much darker narrative. The more investigators delved into Darius's life, the clearer it became that his disappearance was not a simple case of a young man vanishing without a trace. Instead, it was the culmination of a series of events that had escalated under the surface, driven by the manipulative power of one man, Pastor Allen Rhodes. Pastor Rhodes, a man once regarded as a pillar of the community, had built a vast network of influence through his mentorship program, which promised to uplift young men and provide them with the tools for success. His presence in the city's political scene was undeniable, with close ties to influential figures in both church and government. Rhodes was a master at creating a sense of trust, positioning himself as a mentor, a father figure to those who needed guidance. However, as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that his influence over the young men he mentored was far from benevolent. Darius Hill, like many others, had entered the mentorship program with hope and ambition. But over time, his connection to Rhodes became increasingly troubling. As Rhodes's power grew, so too did his ability to manipulate the men under his guidance. What began as a mentorship quickly became a coercive relationship, one where Rhodes demanded not only loyalty, but absolute control. Darius, initially bright and eager to make something of himself, found himself increasingly isolated from his family and friends, swept up in the pastor's web of influence. The first sign of escalation came when Darius began to exhibit behavior that was out of character for him. His friends recalled how he had become withdrawn, constantly distracted, and often mentioned feeling the weight of the program's demands. The mentorship, which seemed like a promising opportunity, started to feel more like an obligation. He spoke less about his dreams and more about the pressure he felt from Rhodes, though he never fully explained the details. The toll it took on Darius was becoming evident, but the truth remained hidden behind layers of secrecy and manipulation. In hindsight, it became apparent that the pastor's control over Darius had begun long before his disappearance. As the investigation continued, more and more men came forward with their stories of manipulation, coercion, and even abuse at the hands of Pastor Rhodes. Some spoke of emotional abuse, how Rhodes would exploit their vulnerabilities and use their ambitions against them. Others revealed that they had been drawn into morally questionable activities by the pastor, all in the name of mentorship. These revelations painted a picture of a man who had used his position of power to prey on those who trusted him most, shaping their lives in his image, controlling them from behind the scenes. The escalation reached its peak when Darius, burdened by the pressure of the program, attempted to break free from Rhodes's grasp. Those closest to him recall how Darius had started to distance himself from Pastor, seeking more independence and attempting to reconnect with his family and friends. But this attempt at freedom was met with resistance. Pastor Rhodes, whose influence extended far beyond the walls of his church, was not willing to let Darius go so easily. The manipulation turned darker as Rhodes began to threaten Darius's future, using his power over the program and the people in Darius's life to keep him under control. Darius's disappearance occurred shortly after one such encounter. Investigators later learned that it was during this time that Rhodes had begun to isolate Darius completely. His family, already concerned about his withdrawal, noticed that Darius was no longer answering calls or responding to messages. The final straw was a last-minute meeting between Darius and the pastor, one that would never be fully explained. Shortly after that meeting, Darius vanished without a trace, leaving no evidence behind. The case went cold. But what the police didn't know at the time was that Pastor Rhodes had orchestrated Darius's disappearance, hiding him away from the world as he carried out a plan that would ultimately cover up his dark secrets. Darius's body, hidden beneath the billboard, had been placed there as a final act of control, an attempt to bury the truth along with the young man who knew too much. The billboard, once a symbol of hope and opportunity, became a grave marker, a monument to the pastor's unchecked power and the lengths he was willing to go to protect his secrets. In the months following Darius's disappearance, rumors began to swirl within the community. While many refused to believe the worst about Pastor Rhodes, others grew suspicious. The pastor's political ambitions seemed to overshadow his religious duties, and whispers of corruption began to circulate. His association with powerful figures in the city, coupled with the strange circumstances surrounding Darius's case, painted a picture of a man who would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. For some, it became clear that the pastor was involved in far more than just the mentorship program. The investigation was beginning to reveal that Darius Hill's death was not a tragic accident, but part of a much larger web of corruption, abuse, and deceit. The discovery of Darius Hill's body beneath the billboard sent shockwaves through the Philadelphia community. What had once been a missing person case now became a chilling murder investigation, revealing a level of deception and manipulation that no one had expected. As the truth about Pastor Allen Rhodes's involvement began to unfold, the immediate aftermath was one of disbelief, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. For Darius's family, the impact of his death was devastating. His mother, once hopeful that her son would return, now had to face the reality of his loss in the most cruel and public way. The pain of not knowing what had happened to her son for 7 years was replaced by an overwhelming grief, a grief made all the more intense by the revelation that he had been taken by the very man he had trusted. Darius's family struggled to comprehend how the pastor, whom they had once seen as a respectable figure, could have manipulated and ultimately destroyed their son's life. The pain was compounded by feelings of guilt, as they grappled with the notion that they had not been able to protect him from such a betrayal. Friends and acquaintances who had once admired Pastor Rhodes for his work in the community were left in shock, their trust shattered. Many who had seen the pastor as a mentor, a spiritual guide, could no longer reconcile the man they had known with the revelation of his dark actions. Some, however, continued to defend Rhodes, blinded by his political influence and the power he had held over them for years. These divided reactions within the community only added to the tension as the investigation continued. For some, it was difficult to accept the truth, especially considering the pastor's public stature and the respect he commanded. For others, the revelation was the final straw. A man who had built his reputation on trust had used that very trust to conceal horrific crimes. The authorities, too, were grappling with the enormity of the case. As the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that this was not an isolated incident. More victims, who had once been under Rhodes's mentorship, came forward with their stories of manipulation and abuse. The case expanded beyond Darius's death, revealing a pattern of exploitation and control. The investigation into the pastor's network of influence began to unravel a web of deceit that stretched far into the city's political and religious circles. Detectives found themselves in uncharted territory, facing the difficult task of untangling a case that had been carefully hidden behind layers of respectability and power. For the community, the impact was both immediate and long-lasting. The scandal rocked the faith in the mentorship program that had once been touted as a beacon of hope. Trust, once freely given to a man of power, was now in tatters. Families who had once seen Pastor Rhodes as a mentor began to question everything they had been taught to believe. The moral fabric of the community had been ripped apart, leaving a sense of unease and uncertainty in its wake. The program, once a symbol of growth and success, was now a symbol of exploitation and control, forever tainted by the actions of the man behind it. Amid the chaos, Darius's story continued to resonate with those who had known him. His life, his potential, and his tragic death became a symbol of the dangers of misplaced trust and the destructive nature of unchecked power. As more revelations came to light, the emotional toll of Darius's loss rippled through the community, forcing individuals to confront uncomfortable truths about those they had once trusted. As the investigation into Darius Hill's death continued, the web of deception surrounding Pastor Alan Rhodes grew more intricate. What had initially appeared to be a case of a missing person now spiraled into something far darker, as detectives began to piece together the disturbing truths behind Rhodes's manipulation and control. With each new discovery, the investigation took on a momentum that threatened to shake the very foundations of the community. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Darius's disappearance was far from an isolated incident. As they dug deeper into the mentorship program, they found a pattern of abuse, coercion, and exploitation that had affected several young men who had once been part of Rhodes's circle. Many of these men had been drawn into the program with promises of success and guidance, only to find themselves trapped under the pastor's tight grip. The more they spoke out, the more became clear that Darius's case was just one of many. evidence began to emerge that Pastor Rhodes had used his position of power to manipulate the lives of those around him. Through a combination of emotional abuse, financial control, and subtle threats, Rhodes had created an environment where young men felt they had no choice but to comply with his demands. Darius, like others before him, had become a pawn in Rhodes's carefully orchestrated game. The program, which had initially been seen as a pathway to a brighter future, had turned into a tool for Rhodes to control and exploit vulnerable young men. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement uncovered records of Rhodes's communications with several of his men's. These records revealed a disturbing pattern of manipulation, with the pastor using his influence to create a false sense of dependency in his men. He offered them opportunities, connections, and resources, but in exchange, they were expected to follow his instructions blindly and without question. For Darius, the price of this mentorship was the gradual erosion of his independence, until he became completely reliant on Rhodes's approval. The discovery of these records led to a deeper investigation into Rhodes's financial dealings. The investigation uncovered questionable transactions, including money transfers and investments linked to Rhodes's program. These financial ties raised even more alarms, suggesting that the pastor's operations were not only about power and control, but also about financial gain. Rhodes had built a system where he profited from the very people he claimed to help, using their trust and ambitions to further his own wealth and influence. As more victims came forward with their stories, the true extent of Rhodes's abuse came into focus. One by one, former men's recounted how they had been manipulated into performing acts that went against their own morals, all in the name of securing their futures. For many, the program had initially seemed like a stepping stone to success, but in reality, it was a trap that kept them under Rhodes's thumb. The emotional toll was staggering. For Darius, the constant pressure and manipulation had taken a heavy toll on his mental health. He had begun to feel as though he was losing himself, his dreams replaced by a sense of obligation to the pastor's will. One of the most chilling discoveries was the extent to which Rhodes had been able to operate without suspicion for so long. His status as a respected community leader, combined with his ties to local politicians, had shielded him from scrutiny. Many of those who were closest to him had seen only the public persona of a well-meaning pastor and mentor. It wasn't until Darius's body was discovered that the cracks in Rhodes's facade began to show. The investigation revealed that Rhodes had used his influence not only to control his men, but also to silence those who might expose him. Whispers of financial impropriety, abusive behavior, and coercion had long circulated, but they had never been enough to take him down until now. The investigation into Rhodes's actions grew broader as authorities began to uncover a network of complicity. Church leaders, politicians, and community figures who had turned a blind eye to Rhodes's behavior were now under scrutiny. The revelations about the pastor's influence sent shockwaves through the political and religious spheres in Philadelphia. The public, once enamored with Rhodes's charm and perceived integrity, now had to confront the harsh reality of his crimes. For Darius's family, The truth about their son's death was both a relief and a further blow. The knowledge that he had suffered at the hands of someone he had trusted, someone who had seemed like a mentor and a guide, was a betrayal that was almost too much to bear. But the investigation was far from over. As more evidence came to light, the pursuit of justice for Darius and the other victims gained momentum. Authorities were determined to hold Rhodes accountable, but the task was daunting. The pastor's connections ran deep, and his network of influence was vast. Yet the weight of the evidence against him continued to build, and the truth could no longer be hidden. At this point, the investigation became more than just a search for the truth behind Darius's death. It was a fight for justice, not only for Darius, but for all those who had suffered under Rhodes's control, for the victims who had remained silent for so long. This was their moment to be heard. The revelations were coming fast, and with each new piece of evidence, the case against Pastor Rhodes grew stronger. As the story continued to unfold, it was clear that this case was not just about one man's death, but about the dangerous consequences of unchecked power, manipulation, and the exploitation of trust. The impact of this investigation rippled through the community, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about those they had once placed on pedestals. But the road to justice was far from over, and the ultimate question remained. Would Pastor Rhodes be held accountable for his crimes, or would his influence continue to shield him from the consequences of his actions?